this is a collection of all the Marvel comics published in May of 1965. So I think this is definitely one of the oldest comics I've ever read, and I did think it was really interesting to look at this moment in time. And so how it works, because it's just everything published in that month, it's a total hodgepodge of all these different stories. And looking at the back of this cover, there are definitely a couple titles that I recognize, like X-Men, The Avengers, Spider-Man, Daredevil, but there's also all these other stories that I'd actually never heard of before. And in particular, the thing that stuck out to me is that there were these like romance stories, so Patsy and Hetty, like modeling with Millie, like stories that I don't typically associate with Marvel, and I didn't actually know that they ever made. So that was really interesting for me to see, just because that wasn't something I was aware of. Now, with that mixture of a bunch of different stories and characters in one book, I think that it works really well for a collector who wants to say, like, collect like all Marvel comics, just because this covers like everything from this month, so it's a pretty good anthology in that sense. But for me personally, I think that because I'm only interested in about half the characters in this book, I would prefer sort of just to read, you know, like Spider-Man 1 through 100 versus having like one Spider-Man story in this entire book. So I definitely understand that the target audience for a publication like this is more of a collector, or say someone who has a broader appreciation for many Marvel characters, including maybe those romances that I didn't know about. So the first story I read was Spider-Man. If I can pull it up here. The Amazing Spider-Man, titled Bring Back My Goblin to Me. And this is something I immediately noticed from these like 1960s comics. The tone is very, it's a little camp, it's a little kitschy, it's sort of like a stereotypical Superman, like, I mean, not Superman, I mean superhero sort of language, like, oh, like, I'm gonna get the bad guy, cops and robbers. It feels very vintage in that sense, and it was interesting to read that kind of language because that's not something that we really have in modern media. And it's like, it's very expository too. The characters are explaining everything that's happening, everything that they're doing. There's not a lot that you have to fill in for yourself. It's a lot of tell and don't show. And I think the best example of this is just a couple pages into Amazing Spider-Man on this panel right here. And what's happening is Green Goblin and Crime Master, they're trying to shoot at Spider-Man. He leaps up, they shoot at each other instead. And you can see that pretty clearly in the drawing. You know, it's a really beautiful drawing, but there's no less than 3 text bubbles to explain it. So Green Goblin says, like, "You can't escape now. All you're doing is delaying the final. Look out! You clumsy bungler, watch what you're doing. Your shot almost hit me." All right, so maybe, okay, that's enough. You get the idea. But then the Crime Master also says, "And you almost got me with those blamed goblin blasts of yours. In the meantime, Spider-Man dodged us both." I could kind of tell. That did actually make me laugh when I was reading that, because it does feel sort of unnecessary, but I can appreciate that that is the intentional tone that is being created here. Because yes, like, they're fighting, and like Spider-Man's identity was almost revealed, so they're like, the stakes are high, but it is still, it's just fun. It's just fun in games, and I think it is supposed to be a little bit corny in that sense. But it was super unfamiliar to me as a modern reader, because we really don't have that in any sort of media nowadays. So it was very interesting to see that. Yeah, but all of the story here is very much fighting and, you know, punching and chasing and running. There's, like, the action is the entire story. Say, compare this to a Batman comic, where I think that Bruce Wayne's internal, emotional, like, philosophical struggles are as much a part of the story as whatever villain he happens to be fighting that week. And for me personally, I find those stories a little more interesting, because I think they're a little more built out, a little more human. And I think that reading this Superman comic, I definitely understood that I was not the intended target audience. You know, I could see this for, like, perhaps kids that are younger, and definitely, I think, like, boys, because the focus is very much on the action of it all, and there isn't really any subplots to it. It's just what's happening right now. And so I definitely understand how that has also changed nowadays with comics. I think they're made for a little more of a broader audience. And that being said, I can still appreciate what this is as like laying the foundation for everything that came after, you know, even the Spider-Man movies that we have today, which I do really enjoy and love. So for all my criticisms, I do still see the artistry in this and I do respect it. But I also found that Peter Parker's tone, just of his like narration or internal monologuing, it didn't feel super distinct from any other character, say, which made me a little sad because I love the character of Peter Parker, but I didn't feel that his voice came through in a super unique manner. It felt, just because it got lost in that expository storytelling style, it just sort of faded into the background for me in a way that just I kind of missed out on that. And the second story that I read from here was about Daredevil, which is another really interesting character. And again, if I can find the page, same like sort of expository style of storytelling. And I think that's just indicative of the time. And I did appreciate that look back in time. It was super interesting. So this was the Daredevil comic, The Man Without Fear, and it's called That He May See, because one of the subplots in this story is he's going to the small European country of Lichtenbad to see this specialized eye doctor to try and regain his sight. This was a slightly more interesting story for me, I think, because there was some more subplots to it. It starts out, he's just fighting bad guys like usual. You introduce like Karen, and they're in love with each other, but they can't tell each other, and his partner Foggy's also in love with her, so you have all this like emotional turmoil. And then the Duke of Lichtenbad, who we went to law school with, shows up because, of course, and he's like, you have to come back to me, there's this great eye doctor in Lichtenbad, and he can cure you. And he's like, okay, I'll go. So immediately, the big difference I noticed from the Spider-Man comic is that this seems to be a bit more of a complex narration. Maybe that's just because of where these specific editions of comics were, like in the timelines of their greater stories. But I think that kind of variation, like they're moving from one place to another, there's multiple characters, there's more characters involved, there's more layers to the story. That was more interesting for me, and I definitely appreciated that more. But once again, you do have this very, like, sort of corny style of writing, and it's really, really hard to ignore it. So there's like the people of Lichtenbad are revolting against Klaus Kruger, the tyrannical duke, and we go into their meeting and they're talking about how they need to like revolt, whatever, and then the duke's guards chime in, like barge in, they're gonna like arrest them, and just the writing, it's like, the Duke's Palace Guards, we've been betrayed, we're trapped. Yeah, I think you are. Like, thanks for letting me know. And it is funny. I think it is probably meant to make you laugh, but I don't know, sometimes I think that because of that style, you do lose out on the potential for a deeper, more nuanced, or just more thinking story, a story that makes you think. And these stories don't make you think. Like, everything is out on the page. You can see it, you can read about it 3 separate times while 3 separate characters explain it to you, and I think that is the point. You know, you're meant to just flip through these and enjoy the characters. It's not, say, like Legends of the Dark Knight, that's a bit darker, a bit grittier, a bit more, you know, intellectual. And I do still appreciate this medium and what it's offering. It just wasn't my personal favorite. But yeah, the story ends well. He helps overthrow the tyrannical dictator, and, you know, all is well in the end. And that's definitely something you notice in both of these stories. Like, it follows your traditional arc. You know, there's a bad guy and a good guy, and you never doubt which one is which, and it all works out in the end, and everyone's happy. And I think that's also just kind of indicative of the time. All the things were happening in the 60s, and that's what people wanted to see, I think. They wanted to see good people being good, bad people being bad, and the good prevailing over the bad. And so it is also interesting to read it sort of in the historical context as well, because I think that nowadays there is a demand for more nuanced stories where it isn't quite so cut and dry. And it's really interesting to see how that's changed over the years.